You are watching SADPIE Enterprises.
Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Taehoon King.
I'm John Mason.
I'm Kevin Delgado.
And I am Ray Chang.
And welcome for the first time to Our Way of Life by SADPIE Enterprises. Today, we'll be speaking about racism, which is a controversial topic that not only taints the world we live in today, but also ingrains a deep sense of separation, segregation, unrest, and even violence within our country today. Please, ladies and gentlemen, sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy our first ever episode as we speak from the very foundations to the greatest outreaches of racism in American society today, this time directed towards Asian Americans. Now, to my fellow hosts, Ray, Kevin, and John, I wanted to ask you a few questions on the general idea and also the general, if I could say, crime of racism. What do you think racism is? Anyone?
I'll provide my answer. When I think racism, I think discrimination, or prejudice of one person or a particular group against another particular group based off sort of their race and their ethnicity.
I would also like to add on racism. It can also be your interpretation of the other race. So like sometimes when we are in like public setting, a certain ethnic group may view a different ethnic group like with disgust or like some kind of like the feeling of like, oh, why are they the way they are, like their culture or their norms, stuff like that.
That is a great answer. Podcast member John, what
Yes.
led you to believe that this is what racism is? Was there any examples that you could provide?
Yeah, well, I remember in elementary school, sometimes like total strangers, they somehow, again, it's all about like the interpretation. They just saw me as some kind of weird kid because of my looks. Like, I don't know, Asians, they look different from like what those people consider like the ordinary or the normal population.
I see. John, actually, I have a very similar experience to that, in that I went to a school where the majority of the entire school was actually a white and Hispanic population, and I can see striking similarities between that experience and mine, in that there were unfortunately many people that saw me as an Asian very differently from the way they saw their fellow people of race.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to ask my members another question, if you could answer it. Why do you think racism exists in the first place? What do you think leads to racism? I'll go first. So, racism, it is, from my opinion, bound to the way that we think. So, I hope that nobody takes it in the wrong way, in that I had some racist thoughts of my own. A few days ago, actually, I had an experience where I heard from my parents and from even other people in the Korean community that Korea was no longer a homogenous community. There were people of other races and other different groups within that community that were non-Asian, and I felt a sense of worry about that. Some of the questions that came up about it were, what about my own race? What about my own culture? Are these people going to change it up? Will change come? Will my country become any more different? And I realized soon enough, hey, wait, this seems a lot more similar to what I saw in history in my other country, the United States, when there were other immigrants, especially whether that be Southern, Eastern, or even Asian immigrants coming into this country and being discriminated. I also wanted to ask our fellow podcast members a third question, actually, which I think might be a little bit more interesting. Why are we sitting here as a fellow Americans talking about the concept of racism?
I could provide an answer for that based on my own thinking. Well, because as fellow Americans, we know America, it's a country that is very diverse. Like we just walk out in the public setting, we can find all sorts of people with different ethnicities, right? Like for example, African Americans, Asians like us, um, whites, and many other types of people.
Ah, I see.
So that's
What
why when there's so many different ethnicities, then it's quite inevitable because like due to our flaws in human nature, like sometimes we we sin, right? And so that's why in sin we might despise each other because based on our different looks and just because like our own selfish thoughts about like how we view each other differently. And so like all of this collectively it creates racism and that instead of like eternal kind of harmony between ethnicities, there may be a sort of conflict. And that conflict is like what we typically define as racism.
I see, John. That is very interesting. And I see racism as a recurring theme, not only in our country's history, but in a lot of other countries' history. There is racism in Africa, there is racism in America, there is racism even in Europe. And would anyone else like to add to that, actually?
Yeah, I would like to add that I really feel that racism has developed a lot through because people like to hang out with people that are just like them, that are similar to them. Many people don't like to integrate with other people that have different views or different interests from them. Um, and so that is also another factor that can facilitate the unfortunate series of events and interactions caused by racism.
That is a great answer. I would actually like to add on to that because going back to my example on how I felt about be, there being other people of other color in my own country in Korea, I felt as if these people could be a threat to my own culture. And I had the dream and also the hope that Korea would be forever united and completely the same culture, the same traditions, the same ideals, and it will be like that forever and ever. So, moving on to the topic of racism to a more deeper level and its effects on our society and us as a group. Do any of you have any experiences with racism actually? Could you actually tell us about your experiences with racism? Perhaps member Ray?
Um, I don't have many personal experiences with racism, um, but there were some instances in which I kind of felt as an outsider. Like, for example, one time when I was in the Mission Inn, I was surrounded by a lot of people. Like, it was just me, my mom, and my brother. We were kind of um, walking through the streets. There were crowds of people, and there weren't many like other uh, people of our, I guess, ethnicity. So that kind
Hmm.
of made me feel like outside of um, like the community or the people around me.
That's a really tragic event. I mean, it's not as tragic as some of the stories that we might hear someday, but it's still very hard to hear about that. So I also have an experience to share about that. So actually, when I was much younger, I would like to also talk about a time when I was refused by a waiter. She's fired now because of her actions, but back then, she actually refused to serve us because she thought we were Chinese. And we had this entire ordeal with it. My the people we were with tried to argue with her. There was an entire heated argument with it. We brought the manager over and she was just told to go to her kitchen and that was it. Anyways, would anyone else like to add on to that question? How about our member John?
Well, right now, recently, I haven't had that much experience with racism anymore, thanks to a generally positive environment, which I heavily appreciate. But I remember most of the racism that I did encounter was during elementary school. So like sometimes during recess, right? There's a bunch of kids, and me being Asian, I'll maybe sometimes go up to them and ask like if I could join with you with whatever you're playing. And sometimes I can a lot of times I'll feel the exclusion where like it might not be so evident physically, like outright, but I can feel like how they do not really enjoy playing with me and instead just want to go somewhere else and like leave me alone. So kind of like this isolation. And also a more severe form that I've also encountered during that time was about like how sometimes people also make racist remarks that is directed towards Asians, such as like some words like ching chong or like making fun of my hair and stuff like that, or like especially with the eyes. It's like how Asians they have like
Very
what they
slitted
like very
eyes.
yes, very slitted eyes. So
I
yeah,
see.
that and this is it's a very big problem. It was a very big issue that I had to endure because when they made those remarks, it really infuriated me and like it also caused me to want to like become violent and like try to like retaliate, right? So it's like it creates a very hostile environment between like these two sides, and that's why I see racism as something very important that needs to be resolved.
I see. Now that we actually have seen racism amongst our two members who are of Asian origin, actually, I wanted to ask one of our other members about his own experiences with racism. And now I want to ask myself, is racism bound to races? Could it only be one group that of which is constantly being bombarded with racial slurs or racial remarks, or could it be any group that could be bombarded with them? Mr. Kevin, you have the floor.
So I don't really think that one particular group is to be the single victim of racism. Like I've personally experienced racism much in my younger years, being called sort of stereotypical words and or phrases by several other students or sort of people around like the community. And I've never really understood it at all. Like I would personally ask people, how can you hate me or how can you have prejudice against me if you don't even know me? You can just walk up to me and just call me sort of stereotypical phrases that have like negative connotation, and I just never really understood it.
I see, actually. So, with that, I also wanted to add on with that, and I apologize in advance, but I would say I slightly disagree with you on that because throughout the history of the United States of America, we can often see that although the group that is the most made fun of or the group that is the most excluded changes often, it is often one particular group, I will not disclose their name, that often bombards and also just bullies the other groups. So we can often see this during slavery or even the civil rights movement, all the way from the beginning of our country's history when African Americans were forcefully brought from Africa to our country and all the way up to the death of MLK and the progression of the civil rights movement. We have seen racism just spread throughout our country and also just manifest into the biggest issue that we still have in our country today. Moving on from that question, actually, so how much of an impact do you think racism and this racist action has on your life, actually? Because I know for a fact, for me, even though I do not experience racism as much as other people, I still have experienced racism and it still has made some changes to my life. Mr. John, you have the floor.
Well, impact of racism on my life right now, like I said earlier, it hasn't had that much of a big effect anymore. But back then, it did cause me a great deal of anger because, like, when I'm being treated as such in such an unjust way, because literally they were strangers and they did not know who I was at all, and yet they treated me as such. This unfair treatment made me want to retaliate very badly and like kind of made me resent these kind of strangers out of fear that they'll again make racist remarks against me. But now things have kind of settled and it's no longer such a big problem in my life, which is something that I appreciate.
I see. I would also like to ask that question to our podcast member, Ray. Ray, would you like to speak or would you like to pass it on to some other members we have here?
I would say that personally, I don't have much like experience, like hands-on experience with racism. Like I never direct, like there were some uh, instances in which I did feel I was a target of racial aggression, like indirect racial aggression, which I've gotten from like kind of the way how people looked at me, like that's how I kind of felt during elementary school. But I would say I usually see cases of racism in respect to Asian Americans, mostly uh on the news. Like for example, at in in spark of the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, um I actually saw that um there were like the the antagonism that
I
the
see.
COVID-19 caused for Asian Americans. It kind of is served to facilitate a more racial violence against them, against like Asian Americans in Asian American neighborhoods, and how that also affected Asian American students um, in medical school settings who claimed that they were also like targets of like racial aggression, whether that's direct or indirect, and that they felt invisible. That is, they felt as if their advisors or the faculty there, like in their medical school, um, kind of like they neglected them. They kind of saw them as invisible.
This is a very interesting example that you brought up here about the medical students and also their own experiences with racism. I mean, who would really expect the people who take care of us, the doctors or the nurses, or even the administrators of the hospitals, the people who would take care of the old, the young, and everyone indiscriminately discriminate between their faculty members, and even though it might be a far-fetched guess, even maybe some of their patients. This is very interesting. So, on an educational and also school-wide level, how do you think racism actually impacts our school in the Riverside community, actually? Mr. Kevin Delgado, you have the floor.
I feel that racism's role in education is a profound issue that is faced um particularly when it comes to test scores, in which Asian Americans historically are like nowadays in modern times have been ridiculed against and with like stereotypes of being profound test takers, and it
That is true.
yeah, and so that issue and like those stereotypes that have developed um are evidence of racism in the education system.
I find that very interesting because I can often hear or overhear other people talking about these little jokes that they are making about Asian people all the time. And the biggest sort of racial stereotypes that they would give to these Asian communities, I don't wish to point out who these people are, but these people will always talk about how well the Asians can score on their tests, how nerdy they are, how much of a thinker they are. And although I don't necessarily think or believe that this would be a bad thing for Asians, it is still a racial stereotype nonetheless, and it still puts a negative um image on Asians who don't want to be seeming as nerdy or just a nerd in general or a brainy. So, would anyone else like to add on to that? Mr. Ray Cheng, once more, you have the floor.
So, I would like to add on to what you said about the stereotype of this kind of master quote unquote test taker, or this kind of a genius that is associated with Asian Americans. Like I feel like this is not only an issue that is within our local community, but is widespread throughout the United States. Like we can see how this kind of stereotype has drawbacks for Asian Americans and affects them negatively in the long run. Like for example, kind of with modern affirmative action, which tries to which promotes a more diverse student body to be represented in areas such as test taking and universities. And since Asian Americans,
Oh, wait.
um,
Just like Harvard College and also North Carolina University. Am I
yes,
right, Mr. Ray Cheng?
yes, like in the instances of those colleges, they were in a court case, um, they were accused of following these race conscious admission policies, um, which in effect caused lower rates of acceptance for Asian American students in particular compared to other ethnicities. And I feel like that um that lower acceptance rate for Asian Americans can be tied back to um associations or like to associations to Asian Americans that they are master, like quote unquote master test takers, which would influence like these admission officers to kind of draw back from accepting too many Asian American students so that they can accept students from other ethnicities so that they can have a more diverse body of students on their campus.
I see what you are saying, Ray, and to some of us, this affirmative action might be very new to us. So, for those of you that don't know what affirmative action is, it is the system of acceptance within colleges that of which uses races such as, for example, blacks, Hispanics, and also Asians in order to determine who goes to college and who doesn't go to college in order to quote unquote diversify the school campus. Now, this is a very controversial topic, that of which we will not go very deep into today, as we will discuss that in another episode. However, it is a very interesting thing to see that two completely different colleges, one in the northeastern United States and one in the south, to accept to accept the same system of acceptance, that of which targets not only Asians, but also those of whom are like us, seen as overly smart or overly achieving, though I may not be able to recall any groups that of which have any title that of which is similar to us as nerds or brainies. So, on a closing note, how do you think racism actually affects um our country as a whole? If you look at our history, our current politics today, how do you think racism plays a role in that today?
The system of racism and its impact on the American nation, I believe, in some ways, it has positive and negative impacts. Most predominantly negative, because in history, as we can observe, like with the institution of slavery that was like so prevalent during the late 1800s, like the mid 1800s, I mean, racism played in the form of slavery, where like Black people, they were basically eternally confined into certain pieces of land, like plantations, where they were forced to do like incredible amounts of hard labor. And this
See,
system, it's so severe that it has gained like a kind of reputation for the United States worldwide, where like across countries they were able to observe how severe the institution of slavery was, specifically on America, like where other countries such as Britain, they have already previously emancipated all the slaves, but the United States still had so heavily preserved its institution because of how entrenched it was. So
now,
that
Mr.
it can be considered like a negative impact. It's just America's experience with racism can be argued to have been extremely profound compared to other countries across the world. But also in a positive impact, it also highlights how,
Now, Mr. John, wait. By
yes,
positive, I hope I'm not taking this in a negative light, but I do truly disagree with you, and I would like to add on to what you said about America having an impact so profound that it is seen across the entire nation, I mean, the entire world, as the reason why slavery is so bad. And it is so ironic to me that a country which has written within its constitution that all men are created equal has condemned whites and also blacks to live completely separate lives, in which one is completely under the other and one is inhumanely treated and treated like none other than non and also half humans, as
exactly.
mulattoes and also as whatever other racial slur you can call these people back in the day. And it's such an interesting thing that it it not only just begins back in the 1600s, but it still has a profound impact today. Thank you very much, John. Please continue on the positive impacts of racism in our country, though I may not agree with you completely.
Yes, I can see why. But what I'm about to say about the positive impacts is not about what racism does directly, but rather the movements that sought to resolve racism. So basically, because of how entrenched racism and discrimination against like different ethnicities has manifested in America, we see the rise of massive, like truly significant movements that sought to bring about like huge
Ah,
change, right? Like as we see in the late
civil rights movement.
yes, the mid 1900s, the civil rights movement takes hold, and we can see like major figures who like are very powerfully take a stand against this system of racism, such as Martin Luther King Jr., right?
Our
And so
school's
these
namesake.
individuals, they leave profound marks in history across internationally, because of how ambitious they were in trying to end the racism that affects American society.
I see. So moving on from that topic, actually, I also had another question to ask to our fellow members of this podcast here. So, how would you view the Asian minority and their role in American society today? Mr. John Mason, you have the floor this time.
Well, I think Asians, they played a huge role in American society throughout history that has led to profound impacts today. For example, I think it would be good for us to discuss their impact, their influence on the orange farms that we see in Riverside. Whom would you like to add on to that?
Okay, so interesting thing that you brought up this time, because not many people may know this, but if we take a look back at our history at our local city, Riverside, when the Chinese immigrants came flowing into the state of California and consequently into Riverside, the people who were there already, the whites, the Mexicans, or etc., they needed to build orange farms that could be effectively they need to build farms that could effectively fuel and also feed their their orange trees. So the Chinese, with their experiences back at home, they knew how to have rice farms in which they could effectively fuel and also feed all of their crops by using terrace farms, in which the water from the top of a hill would be let to drain down into the first layer and also the first row of the orange trees, and then the water would then be led to flow down to the second level to feed the second level of trees, and then on and then on. This is a very interesting thing that you have brought up to us. So, in summary, Asians have really played a large role in our community as Riverside today, because they have really contributed largely to the economy. And who would really care about California if it wasn't for our oranges? And we would not be California. We would not be the California that people would know today as the orange state without our oranges today. It is a
There's
wonderful
also
contribution.
if I would like to interrupt, it is also
Mhm.
striking how the Chinese were literally instrumental in completely shaping California's citrus industry and the eventual formation of Riverside itself, the city.
Ah,
So yeah, like the Chinese impact directly on the city of Riverside is just it's extremely significant. It can't be ignored.
yes, that is very true. And it's very heartbreaking that after all of this benefit that they would do to us, we would do to them, that they would eventually include the Chinese Exclusion Act, of which is a story for another day. Now, Mr. Ray Cheng, you have the floor.
So I would like to add on to the idea of like what you were mentioning, how Asian Americans, or specifically Chinese Americans,
Yes.
had a huge role in um, shaping what California, how it is today, through their huge, like a significant role in those orange terrace farms. Um, I think we can further see just how big of an impact Chinese Americans specifically had on the United States by um, kind of connecting it, making transportation like faster between areas that are seemingly very far away from each other through their instrumental construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was built by two separate companies of and Chinese immigrant workers.
So, Mr. Ray Cheng, I would like to actually add on to that and also explain it more in depthly. And it's very interesting because such an important monument, that of which has quite literally led this country from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, has been often overlooked. No, no, not overlooked. The contributions of Chinese Americans and their instrumentalness to the construction of one of the most important artifacts to our country, that of which connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, was often overshadowed in our history by other larger events. So, the Transcontinental Railroad, many Chinese workers have actually decided to help out the white and also other workers in building this railroad, especially for the Central Pacific. So if we look back on our history, the transcontinental excuse me, the Transcontinental Railroad was united and also turned into one rail line between two companies. The Union Pacific, which was started in the northeastern United States, and the Central Pacific, which was started in the western states. Now, for most of the work that for most of the area that of which was covered by the two companies, I would say that the Union Pacific in the east had actually done more work for this operation, as they have gone all the way from the east coast all the way to Utah, just north of Salt Lake City, actually, while we were simply traveling from California to the state of Utah. However, if you look at the geography of the United States of America, in between California and the United States are many mountain ranges, that of which must be crossed over. And this impossible accomplishment was made possible because of the Chinese immigrant labor, that of which the Central Pacific had utilized in order to eventually get across this mountain range and also connect with the Eastern Railroad Company. And they did this not only for minimum wage and also very little pay, but also they only gave two conditions to the Central Pacific if they were to work there, and that was to eat their own Chinese food and, of course, to get paid for it. Not paid a lot, not paid less, just get paid for it. And this is very interesting because with all the contributions that we have brought up to this country, I feel as an Asian that we are often overlooked in our history more than once times, and more than one time, I meant. So, actually, ooh, look at the time. So, on a closing note, how badly do you think racism impacted Asian Americans actually, along with their ancestors throughout our country's history? Mr. Kevin Delgado, you have the floor.
So throughout the country's history, um, I really feel that racism has impacted Asian Americans and ancestors in just very bad, negatively connotated ways. Much like every other minority or ethnic group in America, Asian Americans have basically been experienced prejudice through stereotypical remarks, um, and sort of discrimination against based on their appearance and sort of their values that they can bring, sort of if you're talking with respect to immigration from other countries.
Now, actually, talking about this immigration policy against Asians, this is very controversial because of the society that we live in today. However, I believe that we actually have an expert on immigration within this group of podcast members here. Mr. John Mason, would you like to add on to this?
Well, I think Asian Americans objectively, pretty much everyone can agree that they were really treated horribly throughout our country's history, notably like with their arrival during like the heavy surge in immigration in the late 1800s during the Gilded Age. There's a great amount of Asian Americans that have arrived on the West Coast and California, where they offer invaluable labor. And basically, they were instrumental in supporting kind of like the economy of California, which was like a fledgling state at this time. But yet, despite their contribution, right, which was like truly monumental, they were still treated very horribly due to the effects of racism. Most notably, the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, which literally excluded them from kind of like a welcoming integration to American society. Literally, the term itself says exclusion. So they were completely sidelined and they were completely disregarded from the American society as a whole itself.
I see.
And so this also has like individual impacts on the people themselves, right? Like as the Chinese people, they felt they were being hated upon, and thus kind of indirectly led to establishment of like Chinatowns, like their kind of own collective communities where they can feel a more welcoming kind of harmony instead of the racism that they constantly face while in heavily white communities and other ethnicities.
I see. Now, well, it looks like this is all the time we have today, folks. So thank you so much for listening in. We hope you have a wonderful day, evening, or night, wherever you are. I'm your host, Taehoon King.
I'm John Mason.
I'm Kevin Delgado.
And I am Ray Chang.
And you were listening to Our Ways of Life. Dear listeners, thank you all for listening to Our Ways of Life today, this evening, or tonight. We would also like to inform you that SADPIE Enterprises, our podcast group, needs you to help it in its cause to suppress Asian racism on our campus today. You can support us by heading over to www.sadpieenterprise.com and heading over to the survey section, where you can actually find our first ever released surveys on the school climate of MLK today, and even take part in one of our podcasts on a given topic, utilizing some of the links we have provided in that website. The next episode we will air will be released on either Tuesday or Thursday of next week. Please tune once more again, and thank you all once more, and have a safe day or night.